The debt is owed, but by whom? So, there's this guy running around the country, or running around Georgetown University at least, suggesting that white Americans owe a back debt to black Americans for unfair financial gains made as a result of slavery. This debt, according to business professor Richard America, and that is his real name, is between 5 and 10 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars. Professor America bases his numbers on the gross income of white people. And this got me to thinking, I agree that African Americans are owed a very large debt by people who profited from slavery. And I'm not in a position to put a dollar figure on that debt, but I'm happy to use Professor America's numbers. However, it strikes me that this debt is owed by the people who profited from slavery, not from everyone who simply happens to be white. The distinction here may seem fine, but it's actually very significant. You see, the issue needs to be understood in terms of power and responsibility, in terms of class interests, which Professor America is probably not allowed to acknowledge as he works for a business school. Anyway, my point is that there is something obscene about suggesting that the rest of us are liable for a debt incurred by the people who owned slaves and therefore profited from the slaves' unpaid labor. Just because someone happened to be white does not mean that they profited from slavery. In fact, the opposite is more likely true. When the price of a commodity is low in one place, the net effect is for prices everywhere to drop so as to stay competitive. Our labor exists in a market. That is, the price of labor is determined by market forces. This was also true, even if it was on a smaller scale, 150 years ago. So, if some labor costs only as much as a slaveholder spends to keep slaves alive, then the wages other laborers can demand from owners is lower. This is true because wage workers were in competition with slaves. We don't like to think about our labor, our time, creativity, and energy, as existing in a market, but it does. We are all degraded by being forced to live with this arrangement, but let us not avoid the reality simply because it is insulting to our humanity. The reality is that slave labor, like child labor and prison labor, is cheap. When employers are allowed to make use of cheap labor, they increase their profits by driving down wages for everyone else. In the case of the U.S., slave labor was used in all kinds of fields, from skilled to unskilled, depending on the situation. Thus, the net effect was to keep wages lower for non-slave workers. Karl Marx once commented that as long as labor in the black skin is enslaved, labor in the white skin will never be free. Now that labor in the black skin is not enslaved, but still underpaid and super-exploited, we have won half the battle. Race is used to keep working people divided. Some white people think that they somehow benefit personally from the fact that racially oppressed people make less money than they do. Fools. The reality is that white people live in the same market for labor as racially oppressed people, even internationally now. When wages are kept artificially low for large segments of the working class because of our history of racism, then wages for the rest of us are inevitably lower. White people are not in a position of privilege by virtue of the fact that they are white and therefore paid, on average, slightly more than other workers. White people's wages are kept down by the same system of racial oppression that keeps non-whites' wages even lower still. Therefore, Professor America's suggestion that white people as a group owe a debt to the descendants of slaves is absurd and terribly misguided. This is so not because the descendants of slaves are not owed a debt, both financial and moral. They are. But rather because this debt is owed by the descendants of the people who actually owned and profited from slavery. Most white people were themselves oppressed by the system of slavery in the form of lower wages, and are thus owed a debt as well. It is the owning class which owes African American people in particular, and all working people in general, a great debt for the exploitation, suffering, injury, and death which we as a class have suffered for hundreds of years. The fact that this debt is greater to the descendants of slaves should not be glossed over, but neither should we ignore the reality of the increased exploitation of all working people which slavery enabled and racism today perpetuates. This is Richard Curtis.